Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Georgina O'Farrell, and I'm here at the CEC, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, and I'm a project coordinator here. We're very happy to welcome everybody to this webinar, Conserving Monarchs, Opportunities on Farms in Canada. This webinar has been prepared by Vicky Wojcik and Kathleen Law from Pollinator Partnership. To provide you with some background information, I can say that Pollinator Partnership mission is to promote the health of pollinators, critical to food and ecosystems, through conservation, education, and research. Pollinator Partnership Canada was founded in 2013, more effectively targets the unique opportunities and challenges faced by Canada's pollinators and the ecosystems and economies that depend on them. Pollinator Partnership Canada works closely with local non-for-profit organizations, charities, businesses, and governments, and also partners with U.S. and Mexican groups to support cross-border and migratory pollinators throughout North America. We're really happy to have Kathleen and Vicky giving this webinar today. Kathleen Law, one of our speakers today, is a Canada Outreach Program Manager at Pollinator Partnership Canada. Kathleen's interest in native plants and restoration ecology led her to discover a love for pollinators and a fascination with a crucial role in sustaining ecosystems. She completed a master's degree in geography at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, where her research focused on farmer-centered and collaborative approaches to pollinator conservation on farmland. Kathleen led environmental leadership workshops and research internationally. Now based in Toronto, Ontario, Kathleen is engaged with both the urban and rural conservation communities, with a special place in her heart for farmers. Vicky, another one of our presenters today, has been working to protect and promote pollinators with Pollinator Partnership since 2011. As a research director, she oversees Pollinator Partnership research program, keeping on top of new and emerging pollinator issues. Vicky joined the San Francisco team after completing her PhD in environmental science policy and management at UC Berkeley. Vicky's contributions to pollinator research and conservation include numerous peer-reviewed papers, book chapters, policy pieces, planting guides, and technical manuals. We're really happy to have Vicky and Kathleen give it this seminar today, this webinar, and I'm just going to give the floor to them. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Georgina. So I'd like to welcome everyone again. Thank you for attending the webinar. I'll give you a brief outline of what you can expect from us in the next 40 minutes or so. I'll have the opportunity to go over the monarch butterfly life cycle and the migration to give us some background on the species, looking at the conservation challenges and statuses that exist. And then Kathleen will start with giving you a background on the opportunities that are available to you as farmers, some tools and resources you can use, and we'll circle back with some recognition for the stewardship that you can help achieve on your lands. So the monarch butterfly life cycle, we're all familiar with monarch butterflies, either from our childhood, chasing butterflies and seeing caterpillars, or even as an adult, experiencing monarch butterflies fly through the landscape in the summer. The monarch butterfly, like all butterflies and like all insects, has a life cycle where it goes through an egg stage, a larval stage, a pupa stage, and then an adult. So this life cycle is really, really interesting and quite unique, and I think a lot of us really appreciate some of the fantastic changes that happen as the monarch butterfly transitions. So to give you a little bit more background on these various life stages, here's a close-up view of the monarch butterfly egg. highly unlikely that you'd ever experience this unless you were really looking for it. Monarch butterfly eggs are about 1 millimeter large, so they're certainly minuscule and easy to miss, laid on the underside of milkweed leaves. From this egg, a very small caterpillar hatches, eats its eggshell, and then proceeds to grow and eat more of the monarch leaf tissue. The caterpillar grows, molting and growing over about a 2-week period. And we're all pretty familiar with some of the more striking color patterns on the monarch butterfly and the caterpillar that you often see. This caterpillar then will form a chrysalis where it metamorphosizes into an adult. And then we have the monarch butterfly adult that we're familiar with that visits flowers for nectar and participates in the migration. What is quite unique about the monarch butterfly life cycle that makes it different than most insect life cycles is that this life cycle takes place in various parts of the world throughout multiple generations through the season. So you actually have multiple monarch life cycles occurring throughout northern Mexico, in through the southern United States, up into the northern United States, and then southern Canada. The way this life cycle works is that in the early spring, adult monarchs leave their migratory grounds in Mexico and produce the first generation of new monarchs for that year. Those monarchs then fly a little further north. And in the late spring and early summer, we see 2 and 3, the second and third generation of monarchs produced in the landscapes that we're seeing. So when we're walking around in our fields in July, we often are seeing these monarchs that are the great-grandchildren of the monarch that left Mexico. Then as the summer comes to an end, the 4th generation, the great-great-grandchildren of the monarchs that left the breeding grounds in Mexico, head back to overwintering grounds. So it's a fascinating phenomenon where over 4 generations the cycle repeats itself. And each year, more than 50 million monarch butterflies make this 500-kilometer journey back and forth throughout our landscapes. Here's another visualization of what that journey looks like to give you a bit of context. The overwintering grounds for monarch butterflies are a couple hours north of Mexico City in central Mexico. When monarch butterflies start to fly north, they proceed through the northern part of Mexico into the southern United States. And then as spring transitions into summer, they start passing through the Corn Belt, the American Midwest. And then we see them in Canada. Now there is an eastern and a western migration. We're going to focus on the eastern migration of monarchs. It's the one that's the largest and the most significant for Canada. And in Canada, where we see the most monarchs are in Ontario, Quebec, and parts of southern Manitoba. Those are the areas that are really hot spots for monarch butterflies. We do know something about this monarch migration because the population has been monitored since the mid-90s. And we have seen an unfortunate pattern of decline in the number of monarch butterflies that are making it down to the overwintering sites in Mexico. In fact, there's been a 90% decline in monarch butterflies over the last 20 years. And the factors that are driving this are primarily linked to habitat loss that comes in multiple forms. So within the areas where monarch butterflies breed throughout the spring and summer, there have been, in Canada in particular, almost 1 million hectares of prime farmland lost to development. In addition to this, farming practices relating to increased use of Roundup Ready corn and soy crops, larger machinery and increasing field sizes have resulted in lower amounts of milkweed in agricultural areas. And these agricultural areas were once where all the milkweed for monarchs really was. So as we're seeing habitat being lost and habitat being converted, we're seeing an impact on monarch butterflies. So what exactly is monarch habitat, this habitat that we've lost? Well, it comes in 2 forms for us here in Canada. Monarch butterflies need milkweed plants for their caterpillars. The monarch caterpillar can't develop won't develop if its egg is not laid on a milkweed plant. The other part of the monarch habitat that monarchs need here in Canada is nectar plants. And those are the wildflowers that are throughout our landscapes that fuel migration and daily flight. And there is one more component of monarch habitat that we don't have the privilege of having in Canada, but it is the overwintering roost, the OML fir forests in central Mexico. And this, unfortunately, is seeing a very similar trend to what we've seen in habitat loss within agricultural areas, where the area of forest is shrinking primarily due to illegal logging activities. I'm going to turn over the presentation now to Kathleen, where she'll let you know about some of the opportunities we have to reverse this trend and some positive things that we can do on our farms for monarchs.
Thank you, Vicki. So as Vicki's insights have shown us, the monarch migration is really a continental phenomenon, and because of that, it means that our efforts to save the monarchs migration are trinational, and there's in fact a trinational conservation plan. So each country within this plan has developed its own goals and strategies, and all this is to increase the overwintering population in Mexico. So what I'm going to do today is give you a quick oversight of what's going on in Mexico and in the States before going into what's happening in Canada, and more specifically what can be done on farms. So in Mexico, the main threat, as Vicki mentioned, is illegal logging. So some of the recovery efforts have focused on community forestry, training people in sustainable logging, and also generating new revenues from turning the monarch's presence in communities as a form of ecotourism. Mexico has also created over 56,000 hectares of a protected biosphere reserve. In the U.S., the conservation needs of the monarch are much more similar to those in Canada. And so I'm going to go over some of the really interesting and fascinating things that they're doing, one of which is the I-35 Monarch Highway. So this highway goes from Texas all the way to the Great Lakes and through the Corn Belt, and just happens to coincide with the central flyway of the monarch migration. And so very ingeniously, people have thought to use the highway as a monarch migratory corridor. So through multiple partnerships between different federal and state governments, private landowners, corporations, businesses, environmental groups, and communities, habitat is being created along the I-35. The U.S. Department of Agriculture alone has invested more than $4 million in funding for pollinator habitat. And as I mentioned, a lot of these initiatives are about bringing multiple stakeholders together to form partnerships. And within these, there are also private initiatives. So for example, Monsanto is dedicating a lot of efforts and money to creating monarch habitat. General Mills is also supporting flowering pollinator strips in the oat fields that it sources its materials from. Canada has a really interesting and excited history of monarch research. So in fact, it's Nora and Fred Urquhart, two Canadian biologists, who are basically the people who helped discover the overwintering sites in Mexico. And they did this by starting the first citizen science initiatives, where they had people all over North America tag monarchs to allow us to figure out where they were traveling to. And it's through these citizen scientists that the overwintering roosts in the OML fir forests were discovered. So that's a great piece of monarch science heritage. We also have these really important sites along the north shores of Lake Erie in Ontario that serve as staging sites. So as that fourth generation prepares to head south, they're coming in from different parts of Ontario and of Quebec, and they end up on the shores of the Great Lakes in these protected areas, in these parks, and they roost there all together in trees, kind of like they do in Mexico actually, and they're waiting favorable winds that are going to allow them to cross the Great Lakes. We also have a ton of citizen science and education projects, and of course the management plan for the monarch, which was released last year. I also want to point out a pretty cool project which is not about monarch conservation but plays a huge role in it. And this is Coopérative Monarchs, and it's a pharma cooperative in Quebec. So they've got an exclusive contract with a very innovative textile manufacturer to grow and harvest milkweed for fiber. So there are about 100 members. Collectively, they produce over 3,500 acres of milkweed. And I was talking to their president a few weeks ago, and he says in September, when that last generation of caterpillars has turned into butterflies, it's just such a sight to see all of their fields just sprouting with butterflies, beautiful monarchs. So habitat restoration and creation is clearly a really important part of monarch conservation. And the question is, where is it needed? The answer is everywhere we can put it. So that means gardens both in cities, in suburbs, and in rural areas. It's also parks, not only the provincially and nationally protected parks, but also municipal and private areas. Rights of way like the I-35 in the States, railway corridors, pipelines, roads, all of these serve as really great opportunities to create habitat. And of course, farmland has a very important role to play, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So I want to start by addressing some of the challenges to creating and maintaining, managing habitat on farms. Of course, there's a question of economic viability. Farmers are business people. You're growing crops because you're making a living from that. Creating habitat, it costs money and it costs time. And it just doesn't always make sense to remove land from production, of course, because you're there to either raise cattle or grow some crops. So unless it's very marginal or it's unprofitable to crop, it is often altruistic to be removing that land from production. There are also some practical issues around space. So when you do have high land and crop prices, you're using large machinery, it makes sense to take out some of those features like fence lines. And fence lines historically have provided good habitat for pollinators. Other issues have to do with rented lands. Of course, if you are using short-term rentals for production, it just doesn't make sense to invest in stewardship the way you would on your own lands where you do have those long-term benefits. Creating habitat also requires tweaking your management. So if you've got natural vegetation from habitats on your farmland, you want to make sure that it doesn't encroach onto your fields or your pastures. And vice versa, if you're creating habitat, you don't want pesticides from your fields to contaminate that habitat. So it does require some more careful, more informed management. And finally, another practical challenge is just finding affordable native plant materials to use in your habitats. Of course, where there are challenges, there are also opportunities. And one of the great things about pollinator habitat is that it can be as simple as doing absolutely nothing. So if you've got a woodlot, if you've got a drainage ditch, anything like that, just simply reducing mowing, leaving it where it is, can be a really great benefit for pollinators. Now, if you are producing a pollinator-dependent crop, something like alfalfa or tomatoes, squash, fruit, blueberries, anything like that, creating pollinator habitat can actually be quite directly beneficial because you are going to be increasing the free pollination services to your crop and potentially increasing yield and potentially increasing your profit. So I'm going to go over some examples of that in a second. Creating and showcasing and protecting pollinator habitat on your farm is also a great opportunity to showcase your stewardship, not only to your local community, but also within your industry and to societies, citizens, and consumers at large. And finally, pollinator habitat. It's beautiful. When it's flowers, it's really gorgeous. You attract all kinds of beautiful wildlife, and it's really something to enjoy, not only for yourself, but also with your kids and grandkids. So here, there's a great picture. This is from Carrie Woolley, who's from Norfolk, Ontario. She's a sheep farmer. And I just want to showcase this because it's really such an awesome example of doing a lot with one piece of land. So she has a cherry orchard, which is also seeded with a forage mix. So she's grazing her sheep there in the orchard. The sheep are fertilizing the orchard. And she's also providing all this great nectar for pollinators. And here we've got a beautiful pictures. This is the last generation of monarchs in the year. They're fueling up on clover before heading south on their 5,000-kilometer journey. In more practical terms, if you do have a pollinator-dependent crop, creating flowering habitat in or around your crop can be really beneficial. So in Michigan as well as in New Brunswick, they've done a bunch of studies on these flowering wildflower strips. And what they've found is that there's a potential to increase your yield by over 500 pounds an acre, which translates, depending on price and all, into about an extra $800 per acre. So with these kinds of metrics, within 3 or 4 years, you've recouped your initial investment, and then you keep getting these increased yields and increased profits. When it comes to creating pollinator habitat on farms, there are 3 things to keep in mind, 3 broad strategies. The first one that I've mentioned, of course, is to keep the natural habitat you already have. That's the simplest one, and it requires very little work or investment. The second one, which I'm going to focus on today, is creating habitat, and you want to do this especially in combination with other projects on farm. And third, of course, is reduce pesticide use where you can. So what does monarch habitat on farms look like? Well, it's anywhere where you've got prairies or meadows, ditches, roadside fence lines, but it can also be on working parts of your farm, whether that's around gardens, so your own vegetable or flower gardens, marginal lands, building perimeters, and things like that. So here we've got a great picture of a soybean field in the background and a milkweed that's in the fence line beside the field. So it's not in the field, it's beside the fields, and everyone's happy. So our first strategy, of course, is the simplest one. It's keep habitat that you already have. And this can look like a lot of things, as I mentioned. Wherever you've got woodlots, buffers, ponds, windbreaks, that is potential pollinator habitat. So a good thing to do is to just simply keep those non-invasive native plants. If you're going to be mowing, just reducing the frequency of mowing is very beneficial, especially if you do it after flowers have bloomed, so that pollinators and monarchs included can get pollen and can get nectar. And if you're worried about seeds getting into your working lands, mowing before the flowers have gone to seed. And it's also a good idea to leave at least one patch unmowed, and this acts as a refuge, as a little oasis for wildlife. Other features like dead trees and brush piles, down logs, those also serve important functions as habitat for nesting pollinators. Here we've got a great picture of a drainage ditch. This is on Rocky Lane Farm in Peterborough County, Ontario. And these people simply did nothing. They just left the asters and left the goldenrod in the drainage ditch, and this provided a great service to monarchs and pollinators. So our second strategy, of course, is to create habitat. So there are 2 main principles that I really want to underline here. The first one is how important and helpful it is to get support from partners and programs. And the second one is a tactic. It's to combine any pollinator habitat with other best management practices or other work you're doing on your farm. The idea is to get 2 birds with 1 stone. This picture shows a great example. This is an Alice Canada project on the Bercier farm in St. Isidore in Ontario. And so the Bercier family decided to create a wetland to help with water quality. And when they restored this, or when they created this wetland, they included a bunch of native flowers for pollinators. So they are doing so much with just this one project. So as I mentioned, partnerships is a really important thing to help you create and manage pollinator habitat on your farm. And that is because partners will help you identify programs, help you identify funding sources, cost share, or ongoing payments for providing an ecological and good and service on your farm. Partners can come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. Of course, you have farm groups that are by farmers for farmers. So examples are groups like Farms at Work, who are in Peterborough. There's also Alice Canada, so pardon me, the Alternative Land Use Service. And Alice Canada is currently growing and expanding, and so there are more opportunities to participate in projects with them. And they're really focused on their communities where they're active. As I mentioned, they are by farmers for farmers. and they'll help you with all the technical details around restoring habitat, and then they'll help provide you with an ongoing annual payment for providing that habitat on your farm. There are also other kinds of farm groups, like in Ontario, there's the Soil and Crop Improvement Association. They'll be really helpful in terms of filling out paperwork and identifying programs that'll help you either access cost share funding or some technical support. There are other kinds of groups like conservation authorities in Ontario and conservation districts in Manitoba. Again, they'll have programs that are farm specific and some funding to help you get materials. And often people will be able to provide you with volunteer labor if that requires some weeding, for example, or some planting. So the second strategy that I wanted to underline was how great and how effective it is to combine pollinator and monarch habitat with other BMPs. So this is really, as I said, getting two birds with one stone. So if you're going to be creating a riparian buffer, windbreaks, if you're doing anything around drainage ponds, wetlands, grassy areas around buildings, or anything around marginal and unproductive field corners, this is a great opportunity to also include pollinator and monarch considerations. So let's talk a bit about the nitty-gritty of habitat creation projects on farms. There are 5 steps. They're outlined here, steps 1 to 5. So of course, you've got to select the right site. You've got to plan, budget, and design. You have to prepare the site. Eventually, all of that leads to establishing the plans. And once that's done, you maintain and manage over the long term. So step 1, in terms of selecting a site, as I mentioned, and I want to reiterate once again, if you can combine a pollinator site with another BMP, that's really fantastic. What you want, ideally, is an open prairie-like site with good sun exposure. You also want to be cognizant of adjacent land use. So what's the pesticide regime? Is there a risk of drift? Is it a very weedy site, or is there the risk for a lot of weeds to get into your site, onto your site? You've got tools at your disposal like Google Earth, of course. You also have in Ontario the OMAFRA Ag Info Atlas, and that's what's pictured here on the screen. Using soil maps is also really helpful in terms of determining what kind of native plants and flowers you're going to be able to put onto your site. And so you can ask yourself what the historical vegetation is, and also whether there's any residual herbicide that might interfere with plant establishment. In terms of planning, budgeting, and design, which is step 2, it's important to establish a timeline. And in this regard, it's good to be patient because native plants take a while to establish. Of course, if you're dealing with weeds, it is going to take longer. The weedier the site, the longer it's going to take to eradicate those weeds or at least control them sufficiently. You also want to keep in mind that the best time to establish native plants is early in the spring or late in the fall. Other things you want to plan around are the availability of local native species. And you want to think of getting 3 flowering species for spring, summer, and fall each. And this is really ideal in terms of providing a continuous supply of nectar and pollen for pollinators. The other thing that works really well is getting a 50-50 flower to grass ratio. So people all over North America who've worked with tall grass prairie restoration and meadow restoration have found that that's a good ratio to get a good amount of flowers but also prevent weeds from taking over. And because grass seed is less expensive than flower seed, that ratio helps diminish the costs. The other part of step 2, of course, is budgeting, which is going to be very, very important. There are some great tools online. One of them is the Xerces Society Pollinator Program Seed Rate Calculator. That's what we have up here. And basically, it allows you to select some species, input cost and seeding rate, and determine how much this project is going to cost you. Your partners, especially if you're working with people who have experience doing landscape restoration, will be able to help you with budgeting site as well. The other option, if you don't want to go down the path of customizing your own seed mix, which I have to mention is really fun to do, the other option, of course, is to get a ready seed mix for this kind of purpose. They're often going to be a little less expensive and might be easier to deal with. Again, with your partners, the budgeting, or your partners will be able to help you with the budgeting portion and access cost share funding. Step 3, prepare the site. So I don't have to tell farmers that weed eradication is a crucial step to successful planting. Herbicide, of course, is one option, and I would recommend that after applying herbicide that you avoid tilling, as this is going to bring up any dormant seeds. Another option that's worked quite well is solarization. So this just involves laying a polyethylene tarp over the area and letting it kill the vegetation and the seeds that are closer to the surface, basically just through high temperatures. At the end of this process, you want to end up with a smooth and lightly packed surface. Ideally, this will be ready by late fall, at which time you can start establishing your plant. So you've got a few options. Definitely seeding is going to be less expensive than planting plugs or container plants. So I'm going to focus on that for the moment. If you're doing a relatively large site, so an acre or 2 or more, mechanical seeding is going to be the most effective option. So if you have access to an organization that has equipment, that's a really effective way of doing it. If it's a smaller site, if you're doing under 1 acre, you can hand broadcast and then just make sure to roll over the soil with just a regular old lawn roller. And if you're hand broadcasting, look for about 40 seeds per square foot. Once that's done, basically you're into the maintenance and management portion. So if you're seeding in the fall, the first year will be starting in the next spring. And at that time, your native plants are going to be spending all of their energy throwing down an extensive root system. And so this is what usually happens in the first year or 2. So in this time, in the years 1 and 2, you want to mow regularly. And that's because that'll help cut down weeds, and it also won't interfere with the native plants. By year 3, you should start seeing some blooms. So at that time, the roots are well established, and so the flowers are maturing, and they're going to be flowering. And so again, at this time, you want to mow annually as a form of vegetation or to stimulate growth, but also cut down on weeds and prevent them from going to seed. Again, you want to leave one patch unmowed as much as you can because this acts as a refuge for wildlife. And in the longer term, just going in to likely rake the surface to incorporate seeds or throwing down some extra wildflower seed is going to help keep that diversity and keep an ongoing flower patch. And this one little, it's not really a poem, but it's just an expression in the tall grass restoration community is the first year the prairie sleeps, second year the prairie creeps, and the third year the prairie leaps. And at that time, it's for you to enjoy. So that's the nitty-gritty of habitat restoration. I haven't gone into all the details just because of time constraints, and also every site is going to be different. So again, I just want to reiterate how important and how helpful it is to get help through organizations and partners. So there are lots of people doing this kind of work across Canada, including in the main monarch breeding ranges. So ALS Canada that I've mentioned, Farms at Work, Stuck Unlimited, Nature Conservancy of Canada, and then a lot of ag groups like Soil and Crop Improvement Association in Quebec. We have Union des Producteurs Agricoles, conservation authorities, conservation districts. All these people have a variety of programs and can help you fill out forms, access cost share funding, and this will just make things so much easier. We at Pollinator Partnership also have these great guides. They're free, they're available online. We have one that is specifically for pollinator habitat on farms, and so there you'll get some more details on this habitat creation that we went over, as well as some different strategies depending on your farm type. So whether you're growing fruit or you're raising cattle or you're growing grain crops, there are different ways of approaching pollinator habitat. And finally, we also have eco-regional guides, and these contain lists of flowers for your region.
Excellent. So once you have a pollinator habitat in place, there's still a great opportunity to continue to support monarch butterflies, other pollinators, and get recognized for the work that you're doing. So before we close the presentation and open the table up to some questions, I wanted to give you some examples of ways in which you can brand your business to get recognition for the stewardship that you're achieving. So there are many ways that you can certify habitat as being supportive of pollinators. In particular, bee-friendly farming is a certification that validates the efforts that are going on your farm that support pollinators. And habitats that support bees are habitats that support butterflies, which are habitats that also support monarch butterflies. With bee-friendly farming, you have the opportunity as well to market any on-farm or off-farm products with the bee-friendly farming logo, further branding the work that you're doing as part of the larger community that is helping to support pollinators. This sort of recognition takes many forms. So the image I'm showing you here, the map with all the dots, are actually registered bee-friendly farms within Southern Ontario. And there's a great opportunity to become part of the community. It's actually a global community. So great network of people there. We recognize the efforts that farmers make on their properties, in their communities, for pollinators every year by recognizing a Canadian farmer that has done outstanding work for pollinators with the Pollinator Advocate Award. Recent winners include David Ansell of Goldenrod Farms and Marc and Chantal Bessier of Frem Agribert. And we have another call for applications coming out shortly this year. So I would encourage everyone that has existing efforts on their farm, because if you remember back to one of the first things that Kathleen said, you could just do nothing and maintain the wild areas you have in your landscape for pollinators. Consider becoming a member of Bee Friendly Farming or any other organization locally that is promoting the great stewardship you do on your land. So with that, we're going to open it up for questions. We really do want to thank you for your attendance and hope that you have received the information that was presented to you. And I'll leave our contact information as we accept your questions. Please feel free to email us individually. You can always visit pollinatorpartnership.ca or pollinator.org for all of these resources.